Yeah, we will have a Q&A at the very end, so there will be plenty of time to ask questions and unmute yourselves. But I have 12:03, so I'm going to start slowly. And Marla, thank you so much for just managing the back end, and hopefully if anybody else is joining us, they will be able to just join us at the end of the intro so they won't miss anything. But welcome everybody. I'm so excited to have you all. My name is Marina Fisher. I will be your host here for today, and I just have to go through a very short intro here at the very beginning. So we would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home of Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. All the Nickle at Noon sessions, as you know, are online now. They're every Thursday from 12 till 1. We started on September the 10th. We will end this term on December the 10th. So you're absolutely welcome to join us for any sessions. You can find all of the information online. They're all free. You can register on Eventbrite. And if you require any assistance, please feel free to email us. You can find everything on our website that you have listed here, and you can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We have just added the YouTube channel, and we are posting the recorded talks on our YouTube channel, so please go check it out. And you can also subscribe. For the next week, we have Gwen McGregor, who will be talking for our Nickle at Noon program. And the title of her talk is Earthlings. So Marla, maybe we can mute this in the background. You can't see. All right. So please, right moment, please keep your microphones on mute. And also hold questions until after the presentation. You can also use the chat. Also, please be aware that this is being recorded and it will be added on our website and the YouTube channel and places that we would like to advertise our activities. But the participants' names and chat will not be included in the recording. If you speak, however, your voice will be included. So again, I have already mentioned this at the beginning, but my name is Marina Fisher. I'm a numismatic specialist at Nickle Galleries. I'm your host for today, and Marla Hallstad, she's front-end manager and co-host managing our Zoom event here today. Our speaker, extremely excited, is Dr. Marica Cassis. Thank you, Marica, so much for joining us. And I have just a short bio that I really want to share with you. I think it's quite important to set the tone and to explain a little bit what she will be talking about today. So Dr. Cassis specializes in the late Roman and Byzantine past of Central Anatolia, and her research sits at the intersection of the Greek and Roman studies and religion programs. She is excited to be able to do cross-disciplinary work with the Classics and Religion Department, which she joined about a year and a half ago. Dr. Cassis did her PhD in Byzantine and Syriac Studies at the University of Toronto in the Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations. Her work currently focuses on two areas. She is the director of the Shirk-funded Byzantine excavations at Çadır Höyük, a multi-period site in Yozgat province in Turkey. The work at the site is following the evolution of a small agricultural and defensive site in Anatolia from the Roman period through to the arrival of the Seljuk Turks. It is one of the few sites in Anatolia that is able to follow the continuous occupation of sites in the rural late Roman and Byzantine hinterland. She is also currently writing a book on Byzantine archaeology for Arc Humanities Press. So everyone, please welcome Dr. Marica Cassis. Thank you. Please, I'm going to stop sharing this, and Marica will share her slides with us next.
Can you all see that? Yeah, Okay, technology and I. When you see my rocks, you'll understand why. Thank you so much for having me here. I was joking before, any chance I have to not talk about administration, but to talk about my passion is really wonderful. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that the funding for the last 5 years for the project has come from SSHRC, from a SSHRC Insight grant, and we are incredibly grateful because it is no word of a lie that SSHRC has really kept us alive over the last few years. So I'm going to start by just talking a little bit about Byzantium and a few what I like to call Byzantine mythologies in modern perception. Byzantium is not a field that is particularly well studied in a lot of North American universities. It's a field that is sort of oversimplified and gets pushed to the background. And so I want to just start with a sort of a couple of jokes. And the question of, what does the term Byzantine mean? And people send me these memes all the time. Byzantine is a term that is highly problematic because it really didn't appear until the 17th century. The people that I'm talking about today didn't call themselves Byzantine. They wouldn't have known what the term means. It's a term that was applied in scholarship and really doesn't, capture who these people were. And also sort of oversimplifies them to the elites, to the religious, and so leaves out whole groups of the population. The other thing that happens is people sort of compress time when they talk about Byzantium, and they say, well, Byzantium is a civilization that lasts for 1,000 years, but not a lot happens, right? Nothing changes. And in fact, that is entirely a myth. A lot of what we don't know is because there wasn't a lot of stuff written down, and so we're dependent on archaeology, particularly between the 7th and the 9th centuries, to fill in a gap where there isn't a lot of writing. But in fact, what we see in that period, and I'll talk about this more with my site, is that it's a period where we transition from the Roman way of doing things to very much a medieval civilization. And when you get down into the dirt, as it were, you really get a sense of how this was an evolving and changing civilization. The third mythology, and this is something, the third mythology is that me? Is that?
Somebody has their mute unmuted. Found it. I'm here.
Okay.
I apologize.
That's okay. That was exciting. The third mythology is very much an Orientalist, Western view of the end of Byzantium in Turkey, particularly. The claim that the Seljuk Turks rode in and destroyed Byzantine civilization. And as I'm going to show you today, the archaeology gives us a completely different story. And so this is another sort of mythology that the archaeology is able to get rid of. And the fourth thing I'm going to mention before we get started is just to make it very clear that one of the big problems in Byzantine studies is there is an equation of archaeology and art that is completely false. And we don't really see that in a lot of other fields, but we do see it in Byzantine studies because it's so poorly studied. People talk about material culture, and there is a lot of beautiful art. I've given you 3 examples here. Enjoy them. It's the last beautiful art you're going to see for the next 40 minutes or so. But that we need to work harder as scholars in this field to bring back archaeology as a separate field and to illustrate how they can work together, but they are very different fields. So having sort of introduced you to these mythologies, I'm going to move on to talk to you about my site, which is called Çadır Höyük, which means in Turkish tent mound, which is in Yozgat province in central Turkey. And I didn't put it here, but I will tell you that the site is located in a very, very small village of about 100 people called Peynir Yemez, which in Turkish means the village where we do not eat cheese. We do eat cheese, but anyway, it's these great old Turkish names. So here's an older view of the site looking straight on. It's not a huge mound. Most of you will know, I suspect, that mounds in the Near East, doesn't matter whether you're in Iraq or you're in Iran or you're in Turkey, Syria, Jordan, when you find a mound like this, it's usually man-made. And so this is no different. This is a mound that began in the Chalcolithic period and was continuously occupied from the Chalcolithic to the Islamic period. And so when I was a grad student, I was invited out to Çadır Höyük, and there's just a map to show you where it's located, right in the center of Anatolia. So when I was a grad student, I was invited out to Çadır Höyük by Bronze Age specialists, Hittite specialists, who asked me to come out and deal with the little bit of Byzantine they thought was there, and I'm still there. So it wasn't a little bit. In fact, what we found was quite an extensive settlement, which has an occupation period running right the way from the Roman period straight through to the Islamic period. And most of the Byzantine occupation is down on the northern terrace. And here's a plan of the site, or up on the very, very top. These are the normal places for medieval settlements. So what you have on the terrace is a village, and then on the top you have a defensive structure. But they have very different histories. And so I'm going to start by going through the terrace first, which gives you a sense of the occupation. And then I'm going to move to the exciting story of the mound. The material on the mound you can think of as telling us a very interesting medieval story. But in order to situate you, I'll start you on the North Terrace. So the terrace excavations went on for about 6 years, and they run from the late Roman to the Seljuk. And there's just an aerial shot of it. The tent you see in the background is where we have lunch. And so here we have, and this is why I called the presentation this, here we have my rocks and mud brick. This site has been described as a site that only an archaeologist can love. It is a giant mystery. It's a giant puzzle, and piecing it together is quite complicated. So what you're looking at here is from a few years ago. We've expanded excavations since, but this gives you a sort of an aerial shot of about 5 different phases of occupation built one on top of each other. So as archaeologists, we spend a lot of time trying to decipher these levels, and it is very complicated. And so I'm just going to show you sort of step by step how we do this. So this first shot is, again, not particularly glamorous, but what I want you to understand about this before I move on is the very, very bottom level where the arrow is sitting. We did radiocarbon dating on, and the dates from there are Roman, pure Roman, Imperial Roman. The stones above it are late Roman, and then we have a Dark Age level, and then we have a medieval level, and so on, and right up into the Islamic period. So every layer of rock you see there corresponds to a level of floor that is no longer there, and we can trace the levels for, from about the 1st century AD to about 1200. And it's a complicated problem, especially since the things that they built out of were rock and packed mud. We don't have a lot of coinage from the site, and we don't, in this area, we don't have a lot of material we can date through C14. The other thing we don't have, and you will notice this by the end of the presentation, is we don't have a lot of nice pottery. So pottery is the backbone of how we date things. Unfortunately, at this site, they appeared to have, after the Roman period, decided they didn't really like nice pots. They all made their own pots, and they're nice, but they're not dateable. So we have very complicated ways of dating things, and yet we are able to date them by going through level by level and piecing together like a puzzle. So the very earliest levels of the building you saw are Roman. Unfortunately, we haven't finished excavating the Roman, so I don't have a lot to say about that. We do have some late Roman, and mostly the late Roman is identifiable by coins. So we do have coins that date from the late 4th, 5th century, but also nice architecture. So what you have here is a plaster wall. This is unusual in medieval architecture, so we know this is early. And this turned out to be a large basin. Nice flat courtyards. The holes you see had pots in them for storing things. Those pots, of course, were removed in antiquity and then covered over with other floors. But what we have is a very nice building that was probably a kind of Roman villa. Out in the countryside in Anatolia, we know that there were local elites who created their own sort of local housing and villas. We also have some very nice late Roman stuff. This is probably the last really nice stuff. So what you have here is the lid of a small box that had colored stones in it, and something called African red slip or imitation African red slip ware, which was a very fancy kind of pottery that was imported from pottery centers. These are really indicative of the late Roman world, along with the coinage and the architecture. Now, something happens in about the 7th century. And so I go back to that lovely piece of pottery, and then I take you to this pottery, which I always think looks like somebody decorated when they were drunk. And what happens between the 6th and the 7th century is quite interesting. The concept of Rome as we understand it, even late Rome based out of Constantinople, starts to divest itself of connections to a lot of its communities in the center of Anatolia, in the Balkans and things like that. The communities do not collapse. And this is one of the things that we're trying, perceptions that we are trying to correct. The communities carry on. They just don't have the same kind of trade contact and financial contact as they had before. And so they hold on to some of the old traditions, but they have to do it themselves. And so what you see here, and we have quite a bit of pottery like this, which again looks like it was made by somebody's drunken uncle, is they're attempting to create that red slipware in their local context, right? They're not that great at it, but it's what they know. And somewhere between the 7th and the 9th century, they just stop doing that and start to create their own courseware pottery, pottery that is not quite as nice, but is local and is functional, right? The problem with local functional pottery is it's very hard to date. And so this happens in that mysterious Dark Age period, which we don't really call the Dark Ages anymore, where what we really are doing is transitioning to a medieval settlement, not unlike something in medieval France, right? Okay. So at the end of that period, and I go back to this very complicated looking picture, at the end of that period, what happens is that the whole region of Anatolia becomes a province in its own right that is sort of self-governing. And we get new kinds of local families who take up and start to build in these areas. And so what we get are additions to the old house and changes. So we get both really nice architecture, like these smaller rooms that are identified here. And we also get some additions because the housing changes. So we get the addition of a kitchen, animal pens. Quite often animal pens were part of the house or next to the kitchen. There would have been a small market garden, which, you know, the family would have looked after. And so we get an extension to the south here, but we also get a really nice rebuilding. So you need to think about the medieval period as not poorer, but different. And so here we have beautiful floors, very beautiful architecture built on top of the old Roman one. So the walls in the back of that photo are Roman, and then the floors are medieval. So they use the old architecture and rebuild in their own ways. We get some of this new kind of ceramic. So you see here an example of one where I think somebody was checking their spelling. The ceramic is not as nice, but again, they're still creating a kind of nice pottery for themselves. Some nice little artifacts like this little bell. You know, so there's a continuity of the way they're living their lives. It's just a different set of people, but the site continues to be useful. And I just want to sort of touch base now on then what happens in specifically that kitchen area, which is one of the places we understand the best what happens. So we go back to the kitchen area, which is that large, the long piece in the middle. And in this kitchen area, when we excavated it, we found large collections of utilitarian household objects. So things like horse accoutrement. I still don't know what that top thing is, so if anybody has any ideas. There's a little bone saw. So these are things you would use just in the household. But what's really interesting about these is these were not the medieval peoples who lived there till about the end of the 11th century were not the last people to live there. A lot of this population seems to have fled at the end of the 11th century, and I'll explain that more in a few minutes. But another group of people came and took over and used these materials, and these are the Muslims who arrived in Anatolia by the end of the 11th century, who are known as the Seljuks. So what we find is these are Middle Byzantine objects, or medieval objects used by or created by the Christian populations, but then they're in later levels because they were being reused by the people who came in and settled there in different periods. And so by the 12th and 13th century, we get these Turkic people who are nomadic. They're coming through with their animals, settling, reusing some of the material. They are leaving pottery. They are leaving, this is a small metal vase or jug. They're leaving these things behind, which they are modeling on the kind of artifacts that were there before. It's very interesting kind of combination of cultures, which really starts to allow us to think differently about how these communities were coming together, right? The coin you see in the middle, this is the obverse and the reverse, we believe a Danish mended coin, which is one of the small groups of Seljuks in the region, and is a very rare kind of coin, but speaks to this presence. So this just gives you a rundown of how this occupation exists. Now I'm going to take you up to the Mound, where I'm going to basically tell you kind of a cool story about how detailed we can get about the medieval usage of these sites. I'm giving you here another view of our site, and this is from the other side. Now there's two things you will notice compared to the image at the beginning. First of all, you will notice that the lake that was there is not there anymore. And this is because this was a man-made lake created by a dam from the Turkish government about 25 years ago that has since dried up, and so the farmland is being reclaimed. But I also want you to notice this within the context of all the hills in the background and things like that, because what you're really seeing is sort of the way we think about this in the medieval period. It looks like a site in the middle of nowhere with no contact with anyone, but in fact, this was a site that was very heavily connected to the sites on the other sides of the hills, right? These were connected within this province in central Turkey. So there's just an aerial shot of the top of the mound, again with our very exciting map of the squares we have excavated. But I just give you this so that you can get a sense overall of the excavations. Okay, so why separate the periods out? Okay, so the really interesting thing is that while we have continuity at the site from the late Roman period, the Roman period really, right through to the Seljuks on the terrace. What we have on the top of the mound is a very nice micro history of what the medieval period looked like, largely because the Romans and the late Romans were not interested in that hill. The hill was used for fortification in the medieval period, and really there was no reason for severe fortification in the Roman and late Roman period. This area was fairly safe. There was only one major issue with the Sasanians, and we're not sure that it ever came anywhere near here. And it wasn't really until the Muslim empires to the south started to arise that Anatolia started to become slightly at risk. But even up until about the 8th century, they didn't worry too much. However, in the medieval period, they do start to worry a little bit about what it all means and how they're going to protect themselves. And so somewhere between the 9th and 10th century, we see them spend a lot of money and a lot of effort to put up a major fortification. And I point out this wall to you here. This is one wall of the fortification that circles around the entire mound. This is a massive undertaking, and every undergraduate who I've made draw that wall with me has complained bitterly because they have to draw every rock. It's very thick, and this was, as I say, a major undertaking. So we used to believe that these were peasants scurrying up to the mound to hide and look after themselves because the Muslims were coming from the south. And this makes no sense, right? First of all, we don't know what those attacks looked like. And second of all, this is a massive project. This involved money and it involved infrastructure and probably involved a local leader from a local fortress, right? So the provincial leader, probably not Constantinople. These areas worked fairly independently, but it did involve a fair amount of money and effort. And so you can see the major wall going around the mound, and this is just the best shot of it, and little rooms that are built off the side. Now, one thing that we did find that is a bit strange, and we're still very unclear, this is a tiny little room hanging off the mound. It's off the south side, and I'll come back to it near the end of the presentation. This is the only evidence for Roman or late Roman we have up here. We have no idea what was going on in this room. We know it was Roman because it's very nicely built. That's it. And we've gone down far enough to hit other Roman. This is the only place we found it, but it was plastered and bricked. You may have to shift faces over to see it, but you can see there's painted plaster and brick. These are very common Roman artifacts. They take a lot of effort, a lot of money. So there was a lot of effort put into this weird little room, and we have no idea what they were doing because this room was built into the fortification afterwards. So it was encircled by the fortification in the medieval period and became part of it. And we really don't understand what they were doing in it. But this is just behind that little room, and you see it's very empty. The poor guy who excavated this may still not be speaking to me. There was nothing in it except old bricks and bits of painted plaster. They used it as a garbage dump. There's nothing else in here. So it was like a construction pit. So when they put up the fortification, they knocked down some of what was there, threw it in here, covered it over, and that was it. So that's the only Roman we have on the mound. But there was at some point a sort of monumental entrance to this, and this is a couple of pictures of it. We think it was late Roman. Unfortunately, I don't have a good picture of it, but if you look, if you were able to get in closer here, you would see there's a little cross carved on one of these bricks. So this room was something, a chapel, a martyr's chapel. I don't know. I'm open to suggestions. There's nothing to compare it to except a small Roman temple in eastern Turkey. But that's it for the Romans. The medieval people, however, really put down this heavy wall to fortify it. And what they did was they used earlier architecture for support. all of the earlier architecture, except in that one spot, is Iron Age. And we know because we found a post buried in the mud brick that dates to the Persian period. So it was all Iron Age. They squashed it down, they made a mess of it, and they stuck these walls in. They put down these sort of mud blocks and then built the architecture on top of it. But again, as you can see, this is a massive fortification. And what they seem to have been doing here is using this area not for living and probably not really for safety. It was sort of an emergency safety thing, but they were using it for processing things. And so we have a major storage building. We have a forge, which was right on the corner of the mound, so the bad smells would sort of drift off into the air. We have drainage systems. We have lots of ovens and hearths. And again, these would have been like large kilns for a variety of things. Here's a shot of what these would have looked like in the floors. And a lot of things for grinding grain. Huge numbers of grinding stones up there. So it was like they were still living down on the terrace, and they had this really nice house with a nice kitchen, nice garden, place for their animals, but either by themselves or with a local monastery perhaps, or with help from the local governor, they were using this to process grains, right? Because that would have been the major industry in this period for this community. We don't know exactly who these people were. We don't know the name of the site in antiquity, but it's pretty clear it was a small farming community. There's nothing particularly glamorous about it, but it's so important for understanding how ordinary people lived and how communities functioned. So unfortunately, starting in the early 11th century, things started to go a little haywire, and they started to worry about problems coming over the horizon. Now, a lot of this had to do with the fact that they were starting to get more and more indication that the Turks were coming from the east. But I want to stress that the Turkic groups that were coming in from the east at the start of the 11th century and into the mid-11th century were nomadic groups. So these were groups that were traveling with their families, with their animals. These were not, as has been presented in Western thought, marauding groups of people out to kill everyone and everything in their path, right? And that is a major disconnect we have in the way history has presented the arrival of the Turks in Anatolia. These were nomadic peoples. There's a very nice parallel, I think, to what happens in Europe much earlier, right? And they're being pushed east by, or sorry, being pushed west by things that are happening further to the east of them. There's complicated history with the Islamic empires, but the first waves of these Turkic groups are really coming in as nomads. They are Islamic, but they are nominally Islamic. They're still learning Islam. So so we don't really understand this period. They didn't write anything down. We don't know very much about these people except for things that were written down later. And so we're again at the mercy of archaeology. What we can guess is that they were starting to figure out that there was a little more going on. It is possible that either the local leader, wherever he was, or Constantinople decided that they were going to send a little more in the way of support out. And so what we see is the nice walls, the nice straight walls belong to the first period I've already talked about. These squiggly, confused walls belong to this period. So what we get are more rooms being created, probably for guards, right, for storage of equipment, as they start to prepare for people to arrive. And they're starting to worry a little bit. Still, nobody is living up here. Still, we're looking at a society that is living down on the terrace. There's just another example of this. So here's your nice fortification wall, and then you get these sort of weird walls. They dig stuff up, they shove stuff into walls as they prepare. Now around 1045, somebody drops this. This is what's called a seal. This is for a guy called Petros Chrysobergis, who's one of the rulers or leaders in the area of the province. And the province we're in is called Carcianon. So he was in this region in about 1045. Now, this is very, very problematic for understanding this history, because traditionally the belief has been when things go wrong, it's because the Seljuks arrived. But the major battle with the Seljuks isn't until 1071. So we got 30 years here. So who is bugging these people? Who is bugging these people enough that somebody in officialdom is sending a document saying, you guys need to be aware of what's going on? Well, it's an interesting problem, but one of the other groups of people that's running around in this area are Normans. They've been hired by the Byzantine leaders in Constantinople as mercenaries. They got out to Anatolia and decided being mercenary didn't make them enough money. They could make more money just harassing people. And so we're beginning to think that the groups out here were not, in fact, Seljuk Turks, but that they were actually starting to protect themselves from some of these renegade mercenaries. By the mid-11th century, things are getting worse. And now we actually do see people going and living at the top of the mound, right? So we see a lot of panic. So more houses are built, and now these houses up here are built of mud brick. So no more nice stone architecture. They don't have time. They're shoving mud together. At the very end, so we get a lot of sort of architecture like this. Not very beautiful and really hard to excavate. We get sort of added on little buildings. And this is perhaps the most important thing. We believe this is a small chapel. So one of the problems with this site is, even though we know it's Christian from the artifacts, we have never found a church. But suddenly in this crisis period in the middle of the 11th century, we have something that looks very much like a small chapel that appears at the top of the mound. And this is probably a sign of panic. They can't access anything anymore, and so they've had to create a little chapel for themselves. The shape of it suggests a chapel. It's an apsidal shape, and there's also something that looks very much like an altar that fell over. Here's the bottom of it, and this was the sort of the pillar that held up the top of it. In and around were also a number of these small artifacts. So we have a lot of suspicion that what has happened in this period is there is a real panic now, and they've run up here and they are hiding up here. Trouble arrives. So at the very end of the life of the site in the Byzantine period, something terrible happened. We used to say, we have no bodies. We don't know what happened. We begin to understand now it was awful. So here's an example. Here's that little house I showed you that had been added later. This is what it looked like before we excavated it, because they were trying to shore up the sides. They were panicking. They seem to have had a few soldiers. The majority of the population then does seem to have left. And how do we know that? So we have the bodies of a few soldiers, and the rooms where the soldiers were remained completely intact as they were when the soldiers died in them. The other thing we have, and you can see all of these bones stretching out here, we found a stable that was full of animals. The animals died where they stood. So the animals were locked in here, and they were mixed. There were pig, goat, sheep, and cattle, a lot of cattle. And there were, in fact, we have since discovered a couple of human bodies as the bones have been processed. We understand there were a couple of people in there. So it seems that these animals were locked here. The majority of the population fled. They left behind a few soldiers and a couple of shepherds. None of these people made it out. Again, we do not know exactly what happened to them. To this period, we do have a number of coins which date to around the 1060 to 1070 period. And we also have another of these seals from a guy called Samuel Lucianos, who was around 1070 working in this region. And we know from the written sources that he was very specifically sent out to deal with the Normans. So our guess is that something terrible happened to these people at the hands of the Normans. I'll just a few little pictures for you just to show you the soldiers left behind artifacts like this. This is a very common thing for soldiers. We have bowls. There's another one. This is a bit of chainmail, which is a very rare find. The hilt of a scabbard, or sorry, of a sword, a stirrup. This is hard to explain, but essentially what this is the ring of a barrel that the barrel, of course, disintegrated, and this is the metal ring. So these things were found completely in situ. So where these people died, they stayed until we disturbed them. And it was pretty brutal. Interestingly, the other thing we found, and just put this in the back of your head while I finish up, is this. Now, this is a weird thing. This shouldn't be in a Byzantine site. This is a Western cross. It's a St. Peter's cross, and it hangs upside down. And it appears in this area, you know, so this is why we are starting to suspect there's more going on here with mercenaries than has anything to do with the Turks. So in the aftermath, what happens? Well, of course, I've already talked a little bit about this view that it was the Seljuks who come in and destroy everything. No self-respecting Seljuk would have left all those animals to die, right? They were herders, right? And yet we have all these animals that just die in a brutal, you know, the people are killed, but the animals are just left to die. This is a suspicion, so this raises suspicions that this is not really about Seljuk invasions. And in fact, the Seljuks do come and use this site over the next couple of 100 years. So I already alluded to this on the terrace, but what we get is some small scale occupation in this period. They don't use all of it, which is why we have the rooms on the other sides of the mound, which just have the dead soldiers in it. They clean up in here and use just this side of the mound. And there's a few small artifacts. This is a lovely Seljuk lion. This is my favorite artifact from the site. We're not sure exactly what it is. We think maybe some kind of stirrup, but the art comes straight out of northern Iraq, and we have lots of parallels for it. So, and of course they came through that area. We have, this is a Byzantine gravestone. And again, this is very hard to see, and you're going to have to take my word for it. But if you check here, there's a big hole. This is because the figure that was there was chipped out because it was figural, right? And so this was reused in the Islamic period. This crazy little Roman room was used as a garbage dump. So the Seljuks, or whoever the late population was, seemed to go through. They collected all of the metal objects you see here and that you see here, including another of these weird St. Peter's crosses, put them in a basket, tossed them over the edge, and that's where we found them, right? So they weren't using this, they were using it as a place to store garbage. And again, some of these crosses are broken. Here's a processional cross from a military group, but these are in perfectly good shape, right? So why destroy them or not, or dispose of them? It's because they don't have meaning. The final thing I'll stop and I'll sort of end with this is at the very base of the mound, we have our only intact, completely intact grave. And this is a really interesting one because we have, it's a woman, she's a young woman. New analysis says she's a relatively young woman, probably buried in the late 12th century, early 13th century. She is pointing towards Mecca, so it's definitely a grave done by Muslims. The pottery that you see here reflects that sort of local wear. the rock you see on her neck is deliberately placed. And so whoever buried her had Muslim beliefs, but also carried with them some of the Turkic worries, right? And we know very little about pre-Islamic Turkic religion, but we do know it was animistic, and there was a lot of sort of shamanistic stuff about it. So we have this sort of combination of cultures that appears. And just to end, I just want to sort of show you that this carries on down to the modern day. So the spot where I took this photo is a hill just behind the site. And when you go up to the very top of the site, it's an Islamic graveyard. And there's a little tiny mosque up there and a few graves. And the locals tell us that the graves are well, one of the locals told us it was Bill Clinton's house, but the locals tell us that it's the grave for the Seljuk martyrs, the 70 Seljuk martyrs. And the thing is, there is no story that we can find on the 70 Seljuk martyrs. There is one for 70 Christian martyrs in a city not very far away. And so what you see here really is probably these folkloric traditions. They sort of come together. And what we can see in Central Anatolia is one civilization leading into another, borrowing, absorbing, and creating new kinds of communities. So just to conclude, you know, that the region is really rich. The archaeological material gives us a lot of information. And it changes completely the narrative that we have accepted about Byzantine history. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marica, so much. I really enjoy seeing all those amazing photos from the site, especially the aerial ones. Did you have little drones flying above?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. But I want to open the floor to questions. So please feel free to unmute yourselves and go ahead and ask Marica some questions.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me okay?
I can, yeah.
Hi, Dr. Cassis. Thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
I'm wondering, so I haven't spent any time in Turkey, so I don't know the answer to this question. In terms of, you know, the modern Turkish government and the modern population, how did they connect with all of these different cultures that are part of their past? And what I mean by that is, you know, externally we place a lot of emphasis on the Hellenistic and Roman periods, and especially the remains in both archaeology and art that are left. But do the Turks think that way today? Do they place more emphasis on one period over another?
I mean, I think it varies from, you know, as with anything, it varies from one government to another. I mean, that the Turks are very, very interested in their Ottoman history. But I will say they are also very interested in and they're also very interested in the ancient history of Anatolia, the Hittites and things like that. The middle periods, you know, Roman, Hellenistic, that this is material that is very good for tourism, and so they do appreciate that. Byzantine has been a harder sell, but I would say there are new Byzantine institutes in Turkey, new efforts to make Byzantine more visible, and I think its popularity is growing. Certainly, we have no problem finding students, Turkish students, who want to work with us for the Byzantine material. I think it is a complicated problem because the history is so caught up in the politics of, you know, the late Ottoman period, the First World War. So, you know, I'm very cognizant of, be careful how I answer this, but it is becoming more apparent how important this is. I also would say that they have the same problem with the Seljuk period. It's very difficult because it's very hard to identify some of it. So you would think they would be all over the Seljuk period, but it's so hard because it's so intangible. that there's a lot of, these are both periods that need a lot more work, but I would say that interest in them is growing in Turkey.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yes. Hi. Can you hear me?
Hmm?
Yes. Sorry, Dr. Cassis. Thank you. How did you become interested in this area or this particular site? What was the background?
So it's a sort of hard question to answer. So I have impeccable timing, and I was actually about to write my PhD dissertation on the churches of Iraq and Iran when the Gulf War started. And so that kind of put an end to that. And as luck would have it, because my PhD dissertation was on church architecture, comparative church architecture from Rome to Iraq. And so just as that happened, I got a very strange email from somebody saying, we have this Byzantine stuff in the middle of Turkey. Can you come and look at it and maybe get rid of it? And I was at a crossroads, and so I went out, not expecting to be there, for more than a couple of years, and I'm still there. I got out there, I fell in love with the region, I fell in love with the people, I fell in love with the site, so I've been there ever since. My own foray into working in the Middle East is double. My family on my dad's side comes from Egypt. And when I was an undergraduate, I went to Tunisia to dig for the first time, and I knew that I wanted to work in the Middle East. And so, it's sort of just been a complicated series of good luck. And I've been very lucky to be with this project. The people I work with, both in Turkey and my North American and European colleagues, are fantastic. We are like a family, and I couldn't ask for a nicer group of people.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Marica.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? It's John Humphrey.
Oh, hi, John.
How are you?
How are you?
That's good. That was terrific. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
It's in a general kind of way, it's been a difficult time for excavating in Turkey in the last few years. What do you think the future holds for foreign expeditions like yours?
It's a hard question, John. It's a really hard question. Increasingly, there is a push to have more Turkish scholars involved, of course, which I completely support. I think that, people who work in the Middle East period need to be cognizant of the fact that we are there as guests, but also we are building on a history that is very colonialist and very Orientalist. And so as different communities put forward their own archaeologists, I think we need to respect that. That being said, I do also think that there's still a place for us, and most of our Turkish colleagues want to collaborate. So we have to contend with both nationalist narratives that occur in any of these, any places. I mean, we're seeing this in Canada as well, but also working as colleagues with our colleagues over there. And the honest truth is, I don't know what the future is going to hold. It is increasingly hard for Western projects to get permits in Turkey. That is just a fact. But I think more and more of our Turkish colleagues are working, we're trying to work with our Turkish colleagues to support them. But it's an ongoing question. And I think the other thing to consider is the financial cost of these excavations. There are lots of non-invasive procedures that we can use now, survey, drones, all sorts of technology I don't understand. And some of it is cheaper, but it doesn't replace actual dirt archaeology, right? You can make hypotheses, but if you're going to prove them, you need to put a spade in the earth, and the money is hard to come by, right? There are funding agencies. I mean, Shirk saved us, and but the money is hard to come by, and putting together a field season, even a bare bones field season like we have, costs, you know, a lot of money. And so it's a difficult question. It's a difficult question. I don't have an answer for you, I'm afraid.
All right, thank you. And
Yeah.
good luck.
Thanks.
Lisa?
Marica, thanks for a great talk, as always. This has been an absolute treat to hear you present your work. I was just wondering if you could just maybe take a little time to talk. I really appreciated that, you know, the opening of your presentation, you said, you know, archaeology is not art history. And where do you see yourself fitting in terms of the broader discussion, right? Because I think what that definitely showed is that traditional ways of thinking about our discipline don't really work. And so where, you know, your point of departure is archaeology, obviously, but where would you want your work to speak more broadly in terms of thinking about broader, or those traditional disciplines? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think more broadly, I mean, I am interested, I mean, obviously I like to dig things up and talk about them, but I think more broadly, I am very interested in how we use art history or archaeology or literary studies to position this field. Byzantine studies is a field that I would say, I don't think it's hyperbole to say, is in some ways in crisis, because frankly, the only places that you can study Byzantine, you know, Byzantine anything in North America, there are only a couple of places in Canada, and in the United States, most Byzantine stuff sits in literary studies and classics departments, or it sits in art history departments at Research One Ivy League schools, and that's fine. But the reality is, for the people who are coming out of those programs, is that they are going to be teaching in places where they have to teach world history. And they're going to be teaching this as a world civilization. And yet, we still teach this world civilization as if it is entirely defined by a bunch of icons, a bunch of priests, and the Hagia Sophia. And there's so much more. And so I would like to see us reevaluate the field entirely. I would like us to throw out the term Byzantine. I mean, I'm quite radical on this. Not everyone agrees. The term Byzantine doesn't mean anything. And I would like to use all of these things to think about them in terms of late Roman to medieval. And I think we need to start thinking about this terminology and really thinking about the words we use to talk about these. And I think with Byzantium, it's particularly important because there's a lot of Orientalism, right? The same terrible things we used to apply to Islamic civilizations, we apply to Byzantium. It was a weak civilization. It was an effeminate, it's awful. We need to back away from that. And we also need to recognize that Byzantium, that area of Anatolia, is fundamental in how we understand Muslim-Christian relations in the medieval period. The further east you go, the more they talk to each other. And this gives us a model for understanding that these communities were not always in conflict, right? We started excavations at the site assuming it was the Seljuks, and in the last 5 years have gone, oh, it's the French. You know, I mean, it's the Normans from Sicily who are mercenaries, who are slaughtering people. It changes the narrative completely. And I think that's an important change, because so many of our beliefs about the Muslim-Christian relations in the medieval period are based on no evidence. And yet when we look at the evidence, we can, so there's different ways we can place this, but I think it's really important. I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you.
One more question?
Everybody's afraid I'm going to put my rocks up again.
Marina, I can ask a question. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
And this is taking it in a little bit different direction. Thank you, Marica. This has been really, really interesting. What a treat. And it's just like, I want to hop on a plane and I want to go to Anatolia like right now. But just bringing this up to date, can you say anything about the situation in Turkey of COVID? I haven't heard, not that I've been following necessarily, but how's the country doing and how are people?
Not great. They started off slow, as I understand. I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of it. So they started off slow, but it sort of peaked in the cities. Ankara and Istanbul had bad outbreaks. The countryside did okay. You know, we had a team, our Turkish team was there because they could go. None of us obviously could go, but you know, our Turkish team was there and we were in contact with them. And our Turkish director, Emre, said that there was very little COVID while they were there and they wasn't too worried. But just at the end of the field season, so end of July into middle of August, it spiked up. And now the area where the site is, I mean, the village is tiny, but there's a city called Sorgun not very far away, and the city is pretty badly hit now. I think people are coming out to the villages from the cities and they're bringing it with them. So yeah, it's hard to get real numbers from the countryside, but yeah, I think they're struggling as is everyone else. Yeah.
All right, I think we'll have to wrap up. Our time is up, but Marica, thank you so much
Thank you all
for coming.
For
We really appreciate this. This was a fantastic talk. And for all of your followers that are here, I want to invite you as well to check out our future talks. We offer a variety of topics on arts and cultures and history. So check out our schedule. And for next week, we have Gwen McGregor Earthlings. Again, thank you again, everyone, for showing up today. We had a wonderful time and we hope to see you again. Thank you. Thank you, Marica, so much.
Thank you so much, you guys.
Thank you, everyone.